Okay, thank you. Before I begin, I need to acknowledge the entire Bayfield work unit, as some of the stuff I'm presenting today is the results of a team working together to bring all of this information. I also need to acknowledge the Wisconsin State Tribal Biological Committee, because much of the analysis that are going to be shown here are a result of the work done within that group. We've had to implement some fairly significant changes to our regulations in Wisconsin, and so this presentation has been shared with multiple stakeholder groups as a means for attempting to describe why we need to do what we're doing. So there's been a series of talks so far today that really describe the background behind Lake Trout in Lake Superior, and so I'll only briefly touch on that here because I think it's important to remember where we've been and now where we're going. Lake trout were, prior to the advent of sea lamprey, lake trout were already on the decline from overfishing. And so really overfishing was kind of the hard left jab, and then lamprey was the finishing uppercut that brought them down to very dangerous levels. We now really put lake trout up there as kind of the poster child for large-scale restoration. What I'm going to share today is kind of bringing us back to really think about what our management objectives are for these stocks. So Wisconsin Waters Lake Superior are divided into a series of lake trout management units. Most of the folks in this room are familiar with this map. These lake trout management units coincide generally with some of the treaties that are part of the landscape, with the 1836 treaty covering the eastern Michigan waters, the 1842 covering western Michigan and Wisconsin waters, and the 1854 treaty covering Minnesota waters. We're really focusing in on Wisconsin waters here because obviously that's where my responsibilities lie. In Wisconsin waters, WI1 and WI2 are divided by a north-south line at Bark Point. Our analyses have really concentrated on WI2 because which is essentially the Apostle Islands region, largely because that is where the bulk of the fishing pressure occurs. The state and the tribes have agreed that negotiating the terms for fisheries management in Wisconsin waters of Lake Superior is to benefit each of the parties to a greater degree than the alternative to such an agreement. This document is essentially our management plan for lake trout in Wisconsin waters. This document describes how stock evaluation will occur, and it also outlines how recommended quotas will be divided amongst the three parties, that being the state, the Red Cliff Band, and the Bad River Band. We use a statistical catch and age model to evaluate stock status. And I'm not going to get into the details of a catch and age model here because many folks in the room understand it, but essentially it's a sophisticated way and a responsible way of incorporating both fishery independent data, such as survey results, and fishery dependent data, such as harvest or yield. And it also incorporates obviously ages. It's called a catch and age model for a reason. Successive versions of the catch and age model have shown that we've reached a point that we thought we were at a very high level. It's been claimed that we were at a stage of carrying capacity. And it's important to note that in 2005, we were at an extremely high level. But since that time, abundance of age 6+ or those fish that are vulnerable to the fishery have come down at a very rapid rate. And this really begs the question of what has caused such an abrupt decline. And if I had $1 for every time somebody asked me that, I'd probably have a lot of dollars. And the answer to it is, where did they go? We ate them. It's really that simple. When we incorporate all forms of mortality, we really do not believe that these rates of mortality are sustainable. When we compare WI2 to other management units along the South Shore of Wisconsin, there's really no comparison. This graphic here shows many of the different management units along the South Shore. The blue line is the quota that was established, and the gray bar is the harvest that came from that quota. For this current fishing season that we're in right now, we recommended a total quota of 50,000 lake trout, and that was then adopted by the decision makers. That quota of 50,000 lake trout still exceeds any quota that is established, any other quota that's established along Lake Superior South Shore. This is Appendix I within the state tribal agreement, and it describes how that total quota of 50,000 fish is to be divided amongst the three parties. And so I'm not asking you to read this paragraph, but it's important to highlight some of the important components within this paragraph. This paragraph describes a 6,300 fish trade between the parties for fish in WI1 and WI2. And that trade was made because at the time that this agreement was drafted, the state had a greater need for allocation in WI1 to support a sport fishery and a small commercial fishery, while the tribes had a greater need for allocation in WI2. There's also a 6,000 fish trade for what was called other considerations. And I'll try to attempt to describe what that other considerations clause is really describing in subsequent slides. It's important to note that the quota that was established at the time that this agreement was drafted was 134,000 fish. And thus, the state started out with 67,000 fish. And after the trades, which amounted to 12,300 fish, the state was left with 54,700 fish. It's pretty straightforward arithmetic here. And that 54,700 fish was enough to meet the needs of all state users, that being sport fishers and state licensed commercial fishers. The other considerations trade was made to promote sport fishing interests in and around Bayfield, Wisconsin. This area supports excellent fishing opportunities in the spring and fall, and it also provides opportunities for those folks that have small boats and can only stay in protected waters. Thus, in this area here, commercial fishers are not allowed to fish large mesh gill nets during the summer months. However, there is a component that allows for ice fishing through the ice with commercial gear. It also allows for trap netting in the summer months. This is really a sincere effort to try and balance the needs and wishes of multiple user groups. I usually try to avoid tables in talks, but really there's no way to get around it unless we walk you through where we're at. So we start with a total allocation of 50,000 lake trout. We subtract 2,000 fish for assessment needs. And we're left with 24,000 fish for the state users and 24,000 fish for tribal users. It's important to remember that in 2005, this initial allocation for state and tribes was 67,000 fish. So we've come down a ways. Once we subtract the 12,300 fish that are the result of the trades, the state is left with 11,700 fish for use in WI2. It's also important to note that in WI1, where the state is left with a total quota of 13,300 lake trout. And we'll get to why this is significant in subsequent slides. So this is a graph of our creel estimates for sport caught fish in WI2. And much of the variability associated with sport harvest is the result of ice conditions. When sport anglers are able to reach what's called bobbing water, that creel estimate will go up under good ice conditions. Whereas when ice conditions are poor, the creel estimate for that year is going to be low. During the 2013-14 fishing season, the limit for sport harvest in WI2 was 26,050 lake trout, whereas the average harvest since 2000 was approximately 15,000 lake trout based on creel estimates. And so there was relatively little risk of exceeding the harvest that was, or the quota that was established. Our total quota for state users in WI2 for this coming for the season that we're in now is 11,700 lake trout. When we account for the fact that 1/3 of the state allocation is given to state licensed commercial fishers and 2/3 of the state allocation is given to sport fishers, we're left with 7,800 fish for sport fishers for use in WI2. So it doesn't take a fisheries biologist to figure out that we were put into a situation where we needed to reduce sport harvest significantly. When we looked at the interviews that were conducted as part of our creel surveys, we realized that many of the anglers that are in pursuit of lake trout are actually not successful. So nearly half of the people that come home do not bring a home a fish. I know for a fact that I am part of that big graph there. It's relatively few people that come home with a full bag limit of 3 fish. Thus, we realized that by simply reducing the bag limit, even to just 1 fish, we estimate that we would only reduce the total harvest by sport fishers by approximately 12%. So what we identified is that reducing the bag limit with no additional length restrictions was not going to achieve our goal of adhering to the terms that were negotiated. We looked at the size structure of fish caught in both the ice fishery and the open water fishery, and essentially 80% of the fish caught through the ice are less than 25 inches, and nearly 90% of the fish caught in open water are less than 25 inches. So the bulk of the fish being brought home are between 15 and 25 inches. Part of that is due to the size structure of the fish that are available to fishermen. So what we finally settled on, and what the Natural Resources Board, which is part of the management framework in Wisconsin, decided on, was to endorse a slot framework in which we would have a harvest slot in between 20 and 25 inches, and also a trophy fish slot for those fish greater than 35 inches. Thus, only 1 fish can be taken out of the harvest slot, and only 1 fish can be taken out of the trophy slot. It is a 2-bag limit, but it essentially operates as a one bag limit with a pretty significant slot. Looking at the state licensed commercial fishery in WI2, this bold black bar describes how many tags have been allocated to state licensed commercial fishers since 2005. it's plateaued at 10,075 or 1,075 tags per individual fisherman, of which there are 10 state licensed commercial fishermen that operate in Wisconsin waters. Last year, it was reduced to 745 tags. However, given the situation that we're in now and the allocation of 3,900 tags, that equates to 390 tags to each individual fisherman for use in WI2, which is a pretty significant decline from what they'd been accustomed to fishing. When we move to the west and look at WI1, remember that we have a total quota of 13,300 fish for use in WI1. Our average harvest since 2000 was under 5,000 fish, so we have relatively little risk of exceeding our harvest in those waters. And so one of the things that we adopted was to make more efficient use of that quota and allow state licensed commercial fishers 1/3 of that quota. And thus our anticipated harvest for this coming year in WI1 is still less than 10,000 fish. We believe that'll still bring us below the established quota. So when we're put in this type of predicament, it's really important to really look back on where you've been and then see how you're going to move forward. Dr. Mike Hansen wrote a paper in '95 where he illustrated that the abundance of lake trout was on the decline as harvest was really ramping up in both Michigan and Wisconsin waters. And this happened prior to the devastating effects of lamprey. So we know what effect we as human beings can have on these stocks. Julie Nealon wrote an excellent paper in 2008 in which she really gave some careful thought to what the management implications are for the type of regulatory framework that we have in Wisconsin. And one of the things that she forecasted was that a total annual mortality rate of approximately 42% will reduce the biomass of fish to approximately 50% of the unfished biomass. This is essentially the control rule that we've adopted, is this 42% control rule. So really, we shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing a reduction in fish. Right now, we're at about 20% of the unfished biomass. So we're quite low compared to even what Julie would have predicted. Julie also noted that managers should consider placing minimum thresholds on spawner abundance. This is something that decision makers can really provide guidance for the biological committee. She also noted that managers should consider not only total abundance, but abundance of spawners and recruits when making decisions about sustainable harvest rates. So that's kind of where we stand. It's an interesting time in Wisconsin, and so I'll take any questions you might have.